I can still picture it like it happened yesterday. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon rolls that morning, and the sun was streaming through those old lace curtains my grandmother had hung up decades ago. I was standing by the counter, gripping that pregnancy test so tight my knuckles were white. 18 years old, and scared out of my mind. Grandma Rose was at the stove, humming some old hymn like she always did while cooking. She'd raised me in this little house on Maple Street, ever since my parents died in that car accident when I was 12. For 6 years, it had been just the two of us against the world. She taught me how to drive in her old Buick, helped me with homework at this same kitchen table, and never missed a single school play or parent-teacher conference. I thought she'd understand. I mean, she'd been through everything with me. When kids at school made fun of my thrift store clothes, she'd tell me stories about how tough times build character. When I got my heart broken by Tommy Henderson in 10th grade, she made me hot chocolate and said there were plenty of fish in the sea. She was my anchor, my safe place. But when I finally worked up the courage to clear my throat and say, "Grandma, I need to tell you something," and held up that test, everything changed. She turned around slowly, wooden spoon still in her hand. Her eyes went from my face to the test, and I watched all the color drain from her cheeks. The humming stopped. The whole world seemed to stop. "Sarah Elizabeth," she whispered, and I knew I was in trouble. She only used my full name when she was really upset. "Tell me this is some kind of joke." I shook my head, tears already starting. "It's not a joke, Grandma. I'm pregnant." She set the spoon down hard on the counter and just stared at me. Not the warm, loving look I was used to. This was different. Cold. Disappointed. Like she was looking at a stranger who'd wandered into her kitchen. "How could you do this?" Her voice was quiet, but it cut deep. "After everything I've taught you about respect and values. After all we've been through together." I tried to explain about Michael, how we thought we were being careful, how scared I was, and how much I needed her support right now. But she held up her hand to stop me. "I can't even look at you right now," she said, turning back to the stove. "What will people think? What will they say at church? You've brought shame on this family, Sarah." The next few days were torture. She barely spoke to me except to ask about practical things like dinner or whether I'd done my chores. She stopped humming her hymns. She stopped asking about my day. It was like living with a ghost of the woman who'd loved me unconditionally for 6 years. I kept hoping she'd come around, that she'd remember I was still the same granddaughter she'd tucked into bed every night and made pancakes for every Sunday morning. But instead, the silence grew thicker. Then came that awful Thursday evening. I was in my room doing homework when she knocked on my door. I thought maybe she was ready to talk, to figure this out together. Instead, she stood in my doorway with her arms crossed and said the words that shattered my world. "I think it's time you found somewhere else to stay." Just like that. No discussion. No second chances. The woman who'd promised to never leave me was asking me to leave her. I packed my few belongings into my old school backpack that night, hands shaking as I folded my clothes. When I walked past her bedroom, I could hear her crying, but she didn't call out to me. She didn't change her mind. The front door closed behind me with a quiet click, and I stood there on the porch for a moment, hoping she'd open it again. She didn't. The women's shelter on Oak Avenue wasn't exactly what I'd imagined when I thought about where I might end up. The building was old and paint was peeling off the walls, but it was clean and warm. More importantly, it was a place that would take in an 18-year-old pregnant girl with nowhere else to go. My room was tiny, barely big enough for a single bed and a small dresser, but it was mine. I shared a bathroom with 3 other women, and we all took turns cooking in the communal kitchen downstairs. There was Maria, who was trying to leave an abusive husband, and Janet, an older woman who'd lost her apartment when she couldn't work anymore due to her arthritis. Then there was Keisha, about my age, who'd aged out of foster care with nothing but the clothes on her back. We became an unlikely family of sorts. When morning sickness hit me hard in my second trimester, Keisha would bring me crackers and ginger tea. When I couldn't afford new maternity clothes, Maria altered some of her old shirts to fit my growing belly. Janet taught me how to stretch $1 at the grocery store and which stores had the best deals on baby supplies. I found work at Mel's Diner on the other side of town. The pay wasn't much, and my feet ached from standing all day. But Mel was understanding about doctor appointments and didn't ask too many questions about my situation. The morning shift meant I could work around my online high school classes, which I was determined to finish. Most nights, I'd sit in my small room with my laptop, working through algebra problems or writing essays while my baby kicked inside me. Sometimes I'd catch myself reaching for my phone to call Grandma Rose, wanting to tell her how the baby had hiccups or how my back was aching. But I always stopped myself. Pride, I guess. Or maybe fear that she'd hang up on me. The baby grew stronger, and so did I. I saved every penny I could, even if it meant eating ramen noodles for dinner most nights. I borrowed pregnancy books from the library and read about what to expect during labor and delivery. The other women at the shelter shared stories and advice, and slowly I began to believe I could actually do this on my own. When Amelia decided to make her entrance into the world on a rainy Tuesday morning in March, I was ready. Well, as ready as anyone can be for giving birth at 19 with no family in the waiting room. Keisha drove me to the hospital in her beat-up Honda, and Maria came too, both of them taking turns holding my hand through the contractions. The moment they placed Amelia in my arms, everything else faded away. She was perfect, all 7 pounds and 3 ounces of her. She had dark hair like mine, and these tiny fingers that immediately wrapped around my thumb like she knew I was her person. I looked into her eyes and made a silent promise that I would never, ever let her feel unwanted or unloved. The first few months were brutal. Amelia was a good baby, but she was still a baby, which meant sleepless nights and endless diaper changes, and trying to figure out why she was crying when I'd already fed her and changed her and burped her. I learned to function on 3 hours of sleep, grabbing quick naps between her feedings. Mel let me bring Amelia to work sometimes during slow periods, and the regular customers became like honorary grandparents, always asking about her milestones and bringing little gifts. Mrs. Patterson, who came in every Tuesday for coffee and pie, knitted her tiny sweaters. Frank, the retired mechanic who sat at the counter most mornings, would make funny faces at her until she giggled. We moved into a small studio apartment when Amelia was 6 months old. It wasn't much, just one room with a kitchenette and a bathroom, but it was ours. I hung up pictures of Amelia's first smile, her first time sitting up, her first taste of solid food. The walls were thin, and the heater was temperamental, but when I tucked her into her crib each night and sang her to sleep, it felt like home. Still, in the quiet moments after she'd fallen asleep, I'd sometimes wonder about Grandma Rose. Did she ever think about us? Did she regret her decision? Had anyone told her she had a great-granddaughter who looked just like me when I was a baby? 2 years had passed since that awful night when I packed my backpack and left Maple Street. Amelia was walking now, stumbling around our little apartment in her tiny sneakers, babbling in that mix of real words and toddler language that only I seemed to understand. She had my dark hair, but these bright, curious eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. That Saturday morning started like any other. Amelia woke up early, as usual, chattering in her crib until I came to get her. We had our routine down pat. Breakfast, cartoons, then a trip to Miller's Market to pick up groceries for the week. It was one of the few outings we could afford, and Amelia loved looking at all the colorful produce and waving at the other shoppers. She was particularly excited that day because I'd promised her we could get strawberries if they looked good. She'd been obsessed with strawberries ever since Mrs. Patterson brought her some from her garden, and berry was one of the first words she'd learned to say clearly. Miller's Market was busier than usual for a Saturday morning. We wove through the crowds, Amelia perched in the shopping cart, pointing at everything and naming what she could. "Apple!" she'd shout, or "Nana" for banana. Other shoppers would smile at her enthusiasm, and she'd wave back like she was greeting old friends. I was comparing prices on cereal when I heard a familiar laugh from the next aisle over. It was soft but distinctive, the kind of laugh that carries a lifetime of warmth. My heart stopped. I knew that laugh better than my own. I pushed the cart around the corner slowly, telling myself I was being ridiculous. It couldn't be her. What were the odds? But as soon as I turned into the produce section, I saw her. Grandma Rose was standing by the tomatoes, wearing the same style of floral dress she'd always favored, her gray hair pulled back in the neat bun I remembered. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile than the strong woman who'd raised me. She was talking to another elderly woman, probably someone from her church, and for a moment, it was like stepping back in time. My first instinct was to turn around and leave, just back up slowly and pretend I'd never seen her. Amelia was chattering about the colorful bell peppers, completely oblivious to the storm brewing in my chest. My hands were shaking as I gripped the cart handle, but something kept me frozen in place. Maybe it was the way she tilted her head when she laughed, exactly the same as I remembered. Maybe it was the realization that she was getting older, that time was passing for both of us. Or maybe I just needed to see if she'd acknowledge us, if 2 years had changed anything. I started pushing the cart toward the strawberries, trying to look casual, hoping maybe we could just pass by without incident. But Grandma Rose looked up at exactly the wrong moment. Our eyes met across the produce display, and the world seemed to tilt sideways. She went completely still. The conversation with her friend stopped mid-sentence. I watched her gaze move from my face down to Amelia, who was reaching for a plastic bag of grapes and saying, "Grape, grape, grape," in her sweet little voice. The change in my grandmother's expression was instant and devastating. Her face crumpled like I'd never seen before. Not the controlled disappointment from that day in the kitchen, but something raw and broken. Her hand flew to her mouth, and tears started streaming down her cheeks before I could even process what was happening. "Oh my God," she whispered, loud enough for me to hear. "Oh my sweet God." Her friend was asking if she was okay, but Grandma Rose wasn't listening. She was staring at Amelia like she was seeing a miracle and a ghost at the same time. Other shoppers were starting to notice, looking between the crying elderly woman and the young mother with the toddler, trying to figure out what drama was unfolding in the vegetable aisle. I should have walked away. Every protective instinct I'd developed over the past 2 years told me to get out of there before this got worse. But I couldn't move. Seeing her break down like that, seeing the pain written all over her face, it brought back every memory of the woman who'd raised me with such love before everything fell apart. Amelia, bless her heart, chose that moment to notice the crying woman and point right at her. "Sad lady," she announced, her voice carrying that fearless curiosity that only toddlers possess. "Why sad?" And that's when my grandmother completely lost it. The sobs coming from my grandmother weren't quiet or dignified. They were the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep inside, the kind that shakes your whole body and makes it hard to breathe. She pressed both hands to her face, but it didn't muffle the sound. People were definitely staring now. Her friend, a woman I vaguely recognized from church, was patting her shoulder and asking what was wrong. But Grandma Rose couldn't seem to form words. She just kept looking at Amelia through her tears, and then at me, like she couldn't believe we were real. I felt frozen, caught between wanting to comfort her and wanting to protect myself and Amelia from whatever this was going to turn into. My daughter, meanwhile, was completely fascinated by the whole scene. She'd never seen an adult cry like that before, and she was studying my grandmother with the intense focus she usually reserved for particularly interesting bugs or cartoon characters. "Mama," Amelia said, tugging on my shirt. "Lady crying. Help, lady?" That seemed to break something in my grandmother. She let out this sound that was half laugh, half sob, and took a shaky step toward our cart. I instinctively pulled back, and she stopped immediately, her hands dropping to her sides. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the normal sounds of the grocery store. "I'm so sorry. I never thought I'd see..." She couldn't finish the sentence. Her friend was looking between us now, probably putting together the pieces. This was a small town, after all, and people remembered things. They remembered when Rose Murphy's granddaughter had gotten pregnant and disappeared. "Maybe we should go somewhere more private," her friend suggested quietly, glancing around at the curious faces surrounding us. But I didn't want to go anywhere with them. This felt too much like being ambushed, like having my carefully built life invaded by the past I'd worked so hard to move beyond. Amelia might not understand what was happening, but she could sense the tension. She'd gotten quieter, pressing closer to me in the cart. "I should go," I said, starting to push the cart away. "Come on, Amelia. Let's find those strawberries." "Please." My grandmother's voice cracked on the word. "Please don't go. Not yet." I stopped but didn't turn around. "What do you want, Grandma?" Hearing me call her that seemed to hit her all over again. Fresh tears started flowing, and she covered her mouth with her hand like she was trying to hold in more sobs. "I want to know her name," she said finally. "I want to know my great-granddaughter's name." The possessiveness in those words should have made me angry. She'd given up the right to claim Amelia as family when she threw us out. But instead, it just made me tired. Tired of carrying around all this hurt. Tired of pretending it didn't matter that the woman who'd raised me had abandoned me when I needed her most. "Amelia," I said without turning around. Her name is Amelia Rose. I heard her sharp intake of breath at hearing her own middle name. I hadn't planned it that way when I filled out the birth certificate. It just felt right at the time. This connection to the woman who'd been everything to me for so many years. Even angry and hurt as I was, I couldn't completely erase that history. "She's beautiful," my grandmother whispered. "She looks just like you did at that age." Amelia chose that moment to wave at her, because that's what Amelia did. She waved at everyone, from the mailman to strangers in the checkout line. "Hi," she said cheerfully, apparently deciding that the crying woman was no longer sad and therefore safe to acknowledge. The simple greeting nearly undid my grandmother completely. She pressed her hand to her heart and smiled through her tears. The first real smile I'd seen from her in over 2 years. "Hi, sweetheart," she managed to say back, her voice thick with emotion. That's when I finally turned around to face her fully. She looked older than I remembered, more fragile. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, and her hands shook slightly as she wiped away her tears. For the first time, I saw her not as the strong, stubborn woman who'd hurt me, but as someone who might have been hurting too. We stood there for a long moment, just looking at each other across the space between our carts, while shoppers moved around us, and Amelia babbled about the pretty colors of the fruit displays. The weight of everything unsaid hung heavy in the air between us. Her friend eventually excused herself, sensing this was a family matter that needed privacy. Before leaving, she squeezed my grandmother's arm and whispered something about calling later. Then it was just the 3 of us in the middle of Miller's Market, with people still stealing glances as they pushed their carts past. "Could we—" my grandmother started, then stopped, wrapping her arms around herself. "Could we maybe sit down somewhere? Talk?" I almost said no. The smart thing would have been to finish my shopping and go home, to keep the life I'd built separate from the pain of the past. But something in her voice, the way she asked instead of demanded, made me reconsider. "There's a bench outside," I said finally. We made our way out of the store, an awkward procession. I pushed Amelia's cart while my grandmother walked beside us, stealing glances at her great-granddaughter, like she was afraid she might disappear if she looked away too long. Amelia, for her part, seemed to have decided this new person was interesting and kept trying to hand her random items from our cart. The bench was old metal, painted green but chipped in places. It sat under a big oak tree that provided some shade from the morning sun. I lifted Amelia out of the cart and let her toddle around in the small grassy area nearby, where she immediately became fascinated with some dandelions growing through cracks in the sidewalk. My grandmother sat carefully on the other end of the bench, maintaining distance but close enough that we could talk, without raising our voices. For a few minutes, we just watched Amelia pick dandelions and try to blow the seeds off the ones that had gone white and fluffy. "She's so much like you were," my grandmother said quietly. "Curious about everything, always moving." I didn't respond right away. Part of me wanted to hear more, wanted to soak up any connection between my daughter and the family history she'd never know. But part of me was still angry, still hurt by the 2 years of silence. "I've thought about you every single day," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Both of you. I kept hoping you'd call or come by, but I knew I didn't deserve it after what I did. Then why didn't you call me?" The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but I didn't take them back. She was quiet for so long I thought she wasn't going to answer. Amelia had found a stick and was poking at the ground with it, completely absorbed in her task. "Pride," my grandmother said finally. "Stupid, stubborn pride. And fear. Fear of what? That you'd hang up on me. That you'd tell me you never wanted to see me again. That you'd be better off without me." She wiped her eyes with a tissue from her purse. "I convinced myself that staying away was protecting you from having to deal with me anymore." I wanted to tell her how wrong she'd been, how many nights I'd stared at my phone wanting to call her, how scared I'd been during labor, wishing she was there to hold my hand, how many milestones I'd wanted to share with the woman who'd taught me to walk and tie my shoes and drive a car. Instead, I said, "Do you know where I went that night? When you kicked me out? She shook her head, fresh tears starting. A women's shelter. I slept in a room the size of your hall closet and shared a bathroom with 3 strangers. My voice was steady, but I could feel the old anger rising. I worked at a diner while trying to finish high school online. I had Amelia in a county hospital with no family there, because the only family I had decided I was too much of a disappointment to love anymore. My grandmother made a sound like I'd physically hurt her, but I kept going. I figured out how to change diapers and deal with colic and sleep deprivation all by myself. I learned to stretch $20 into a week's worth of groceries. I did it all alone because you decided your reputation mattered more than I did. That's not true, she said, her voice breaking. You mattered more than anything. You still do. Both of you do. Then why? I demanded. Why throw away 6 years of being my family over one mistake? She looked at Amelia, who had abandoned her stick and was now trying to catch a butterfly that kept landing just out of reach. Because I was scared, she said. Scared of what people would think. Scared of not knowing how to help you. Scared of failing you the way I felt like I'd failed your mother. That stopped me cold. She'd never talked about my mother's teenage years. Never explained the tension I'd sometimes sensed when relatives would make comments about family patterns. Your mother got pregnant at 17, she said quietly. With you. She was so young, and I was so focused on what the neighbors would say, on how it would look at church. I pushed her away when she needed me most. She married your father too young, moved too far away, and I barely got to know you until they died. The words hung unspoken between us. When you told me you were pregnant, all I could see was history repeating itself. I thought if I was hard enough, if I made you face consequences, maybe you'd make different choices. Maybe I could fix what I'd done wrong with her. She was crying again, but quietly this time. Instead, I did the exact same thing. I lost you both. Learning about my mother changed something in me. All these years, I'd thought I was the first granddaughter to disappoint her, the one who'd broken a perfect family tradition. Knowing that she'd struggled with the same fears and regrets when my mother was young made her seem more human, less like the inflexible woman who'd turned her back on me. Amelia had given up on the butterfly and was now collecting small rocks, lining them up on the sidewalk in what seemed to be a very important arrangement. She kept looking over at us and chattering in her mix of real words and toddler language, like she was narrating her work. She talks a lot, my grandmother observed, and I could hear the smile in her voice even though she was still crying. Never stops, I said. She wakes up talking and falls asleep mid-sentence most nights. You were the same way. Drove your grandfather crazy sometimes. All your questions and stories. She paused. He would have loved her. Grandpa had died when I was 15, just 3 years before everything fell apart. He'd been the gentle balance to Grandma Rose's sometimes rigid ways, the one who'd sneak me extra cookies and let me stay up late to watch old movies with him. We sat in silence for a while, watching Amelia rearrange her rock collection. A few customers came and went from the store, some nodding politely as they passed. Mrs. Chen from the flower shop waved from across the parking lot. I don't know how to do this, I said finally. I don't know how to just forgive and forget and pretend the last 2 years didn't happen. I'm not asking you to forget, my grandmother said. I wouldn't deserve that. But maybe we could start small. Maybe I could try to earn back some of what I lost. I looked at her, really looked at her. The woman who'd raised me with such fierce love for 6 years, who'd taught me to be strong and independent, who'd made mistakes, but was at least trying to admit them now. What would that look like? I asked. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe I could visit sometimes, get to know Amelia, help with things if you need it. She hesitated. I know I don't have the right to ask, but I've missed so much already. Her first steps, her first words. She said mama first, I told her. Then no. She's very good at no. That got a real laugh out of her. The first genuine one I'd heard in years. Sounds about right, she said. You were stubborn from day one, too. Amelia chose that moment to toddle over to us, her small hands full of rocks and dandelion stems. She stopped in front of my grandmother and held out her collection like she was offering a precious gift. For you, she said clearly, which surprised me because she usually saved her clearest speech for familiar people. My grandmother's hands shook as she accepted the rocks and wilted flowers. "Thank you, sweetheart," she whispered. "These are beautiful." Amelia beamed, proud of herself, then climbed onto my lap and settled in like she belonged there, which she did. She'd always been good at reading situations, and somehow she seemed to understand that the crying lady was important, that this moment mattered. "I have pictures," I said suddenly, "from when she was born, her first birthday, all of it, if you want to see them sometime." "I would love that," my grandmother said, clutching Amelia's gifts. "More than you know. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It wasn't a magical reunion that erased all the hurt and anger, but it was a beginning. A crack in the wall I'd built around my heart. A possibility that maybe we could find our way back to each other. I live on Cherry Street now," I said. "The blue apartments behind the library, number 4B. She nodded, memorizing the address. Would it be okay if I came by next week? Maybe brought some groceries or toys for Amelia?" The old me wanted to say no, wanted to make her work harder for the privilege of being part of our lives again. But the new me, the mother me, looked at my daughter happily babbling in my lap and thought about all the love she deserved to have in her life. "Saturday afternoon," I said. "Around 2. She naps before then." "Saturday at 2, my grandmother repeated, like she was making a sacred promise. As we got ready to leave, Amelia waved goodbye enthusiastically, and my grandmother waved back with tears in her eyes. Watching them interact, seeing that instant connection, I realized that maybe some bonds are stronger than mistakes. Maybe family isn't just about perfection, but about showing up and trying to do better. It would take time to rebuild what we'd lost. Trust doesn't come back overnight, and some wounds take longer to heal than others. But sitting there on that old green bench, watching my daughter share her treasures with the great-grandmother she'd just met, I felt something I hadn't felt in 2 years. Hope.